side. My heart all full of love and my head all full of pride. Oh, to be the man by your side. Oh, to be the one you're dreaming of. Be the only one you're dreaming of.
Welcome to the Municipal Voice, CCM's radio podcast in collaboration with WNHH 103.5 FM, connecting Connecticut's municipalities. We're a source for news on the municipal level across the state of Connecticut. I'm your host, Matt Ford. Be sure to like this video and let us know what you think in the comments below. In the studio with us today, we have First Selectman of North Haven, Michael Freda, and George Rafael, our Director of Municipal Resources and Service Center, who's filling in for House Republican Minority Leader Themis Claridis, who could not be here today because the House is in session, so she had some important stuff to do. But today we're going to be talking with Selectman Freda, and I was just reading that there's some news in North Haven that if approved, your budget, your taxes aren't going up, despite expenses going up, because you know your grand list has gotten bigger. So tell us a little bit about what's going on there, and how do you do it?
Well, I've always said one of my goals is to make sure that we're reinvesting back into the town.
Mm-hmm.
So we now are starting to pay the debt service on a brand new middle school,
Mm-hmm.
which 8 years ago was almost condemned. We are now almost completed with our police department,
Mm-hmm.
and I can make an argument that at 55 years old, before the renovation, it was not.
It might have been time, yeah.
It was time. We renovated 4 firehouses. We're paving roads every year, and we're able to do this by a formula that I take out of my business career.
Okay.
Grow the top line revenue,
Mm-hmm.
and reinvest the top line revenue back into improvements in the town, in this case, the town of North Haven,
Mm-hmm.
and maintain the same mill rate. So that's why there's no tax increase.
Well, that's good. I'm sure everyone in North Haven appreciates that. So on this topic, cost containment is a big issue for CCM. And one of the biggest costs to any town budget is public education. We propose a comprehensive kind of reform package that could relieve some of this. And one of the first things we were talking about was separate taxing authorities for boards of education. 43 other states do this. Would it work in Connecticut? Do you feel like it could pass in Connecticut?
Well, I've been very fortunate. I've had a great relationship with our superintendent of schools and our boards of education. So we have a collaborative environment where the superintendent will come to me and will say, Mike, this is what my needs are this year. What do you think the town can afford?
Yeah.
So I've never been in a position where the Board of Ed lobbies publicly against what I can do. And I think that's critically important. So in North Haven, there'd be no need for a separate taxation district.
Yeah.
And I think that although there's pros and cons to it, I think it could not only bifurcate a budget, but potentially bifurcate a community and lead to a highly adversarial relationship among its citizens.
Yeah.
But again, I'm very fortunate that I've never had.
Yeah, there's some communities where that's not the case, where the cooperation isn't there necessarily between board and the town.
So in those cases, it is in those cases highly adversarial. And then not knowing what actually goes on in those communities, there could be a movement to say, well, all right, if that's what you want, then you go to the public directly and see if you could sell it, so to speak.
All right, George, you're here. You're the numbers guy at CCM, among other things. What do you think about these proposals to split up the taxing authority?
Yeah, it's. I think with anything, it's got pros and cons to it, and we've heard that through even our membership. We've had those discussions, and again, there are, as Mike pointed out, there are towns that work very well with their boards of ed. There's a lot of transparency. There's a lot of dialogue, and so the municipal side is involved in those decisions. But in those cases where it's not, where essentially the Board of Ed comes with a budget and it becomes eventually just a line item in a municipal budget.
Yeah.
And then the municipal side has no control over those expenses, over changes mid-year. And so I think this needs to be part of a discussion in terms of the transparency, the ability to make adjustments, and really just the dialogue between the municipal side and the education side.
I think a good relationship like Selectman Freda is describing in North Haven is everyone's goal, but it's not always the reality. I guess is the problem. For
Yeah,
sometimes.
and you're dealing with, as Selectman Freda knows, you're dealing with limited resources. You've got a pot of money, and in some towns, that money 70%, 80% of it goes to education.
Yeah.
Especially in the smaller towns. So it's a big part of those budgets, and on the municipal side, not having control over those expenses can cause some issues. So.
Matt, to that point, also in North Haven, like a lot of other cities and towns, when we build a new middle school like we have, that's a $69 million project. We get only a 38% reimbursement rate from the state. I say only because that's in the lower echelons of reimbursement.
Yeah.
So that's $45+ million for our taxpayers. But what we do, we incur the debt on the town side of the budget. We don't build that debt on the building of the middle school and park it into a Board of Ed budget.
Okay.
So we handle that. And after building a high school or middle school, that's a lot of debt on the town side that the town handles.
That's interesting. So one of the other issues that we're always focused on at CCM is unfunded mandates or underfunded mandates. And our towns and cities would like to see significantly less than the nearly 1,300 mandates that are currently in the books. Selectman, can you tell us a little bit about how unfunded mandates affect a town like North Haven?
Well, they affect all of us, including North Haven. And we've often said that if the revenue is going to decline over the course of time, give us relief on the unfunded mandates. And MS4 is a good example in terms of the new Water Act.
Okay.
That could potentially cost municipalities hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. So those are unfunded mandates that we have to find somewhere in our budget that the residents may not necessarily see the immediate impact of the benefit of. So over the 1,300, as you mentioned, Matt, we'd like to see, hundreds of them relieved that we can then apply to efficiencies with our own budget and then reinvest back into our municipalities.
George, one of CCM's proposals on this topic is a law that says that no unfunded mandate should be enacted unless it's approved by a 2/3 majority of the legislature. Do you think this would increase the chance of unfunded mandates passing into law or decrease it?
Yeah, the hope is that it would force the General Assembly to really look closely at these mandates and their impacts before making decisions. So to get 2/3 of any legislative body to agree can be tough.
Challenge,
So our goal is, if this mandate has merit, then the majority of the General Assembly will probably support it. Then they could vote to incorporate it. But for those that are contentious, that there's evidence that there are significant costs on municipalities with maybe not a lot of benefit, then if you have a majority of 51%, it wouldn't get done. So I think the hope is that it puts more scrutiny on these mandates instead of letting them get by and just increasing these costs on municipalities without a lot of knowledge in terms of it's good public policy, but we have to determine, is it good public policy? And then if it is, who should pay for it?
Yeah, how do you pay for that?
Maybe the state should be paying for it if it's something that impacts everyone across the state. So those are the kind of issues we hope would be discussed as through the process of getting things like that.
Just to relate this more for people that don't follow this as closely, you mentioned the MS4, I think it was called. George, can you explain a little bit about what that is exactly? Yeah,
MS4 it's a stormwater management that's going to require municipalities to spend money to clean storm drains and to maintain basins and do those kinds of things where it's again, it could be good public policy, but the costs are significant. And so you're essentially the state is saying you're going to do this and you're going to pay for it. So
now, is that something that's already come into effect, or is that in the future?
It's I believe it's in effect.
It's in effect right
now. So and that's just one of the examples. We've talked about the minimum budget requirement, and that has a huge impact. And it could be these mandates could be something as small as just filing an annual report with the state, which takes time. But it could be something significant like MS4 or like the minimum budget requirement.
Actually, minimum budget requirement. What are your thoughts on that, Selectman?
It's actually a topic of discussion right now. Me being part of a CCM committee with CABE. CABE's an acronym for the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education.
Okay.
And what we're looking to do is see if we can come to some consensus on developing some exclusions to MBR. MBR, again, is minimum budget requirement.
Yeah.
And some of the exclusions could be, let's say a bus contract gets settled, and let's say it's less cost than the previous year or the previous term. Maybe we capture those savings and relax MBR. Could be a special ed situation where special ed students are no longer in the district. Maybe there's ways we can use that as an exclusion in terms of reducing MBR. So we're having some good discussions right now at a statewide level on that. It's very important to us, and maybe enrollment could be part of it too.
So related to that, one of the proposals from the governor's plan is reductions in ECS funding with a proposed 3-year phase-in. We at CCM think a 7-year phase-in might be better suited. How would a 3-year versus 7-year affect North Haven?
Well, it would have a great effect on us, and I'm totally in sync with the 7-year phase-in if it had to happen, because 7 years more than 3 years, Matt, allows us to plan properly. In the case of North Haven, maybe we could do it in 3 years because we're AAA rated and financially solid, but that should not come into play. A 7-year phase-in allows us a descending level of planning over 7 years, and I would highly support a 7-year.
It's just a more realistic timeline for the way things come to fruition in government, like how the speed of things.
And one final point as it relates to the taxpayers in a municipality. A 7-year phase-in allows the municipality to mitigate the tax increases that may result from that drastic cut.
So it's not a sudden hit.
Not a sudden hit, exactly.
That's great. And George, do you have anything to add on?
Yeah, I mean, the current law is that the phase-in is originally supposed to be over 10 years. And so there's 7 or 8 years left on it. So that towns can plan, Selectman Freda says, they can adjust and they can make these changes that they need to incorporate those costs on the town. When you take in some cases it's millions of dollars that you were going to essentially receive. You're going to receive less of that amount over 10 years. Now you have to, let's say it's $3 million.
Yeah.
You were going to have a reduction of $3 million over 10 years in total. Now, if you have it over 3 years, it's $1 million a year. That's significant.
It's a huge difference.
So the current law is that it's going to be phased in over till 2028. But just accelerating that obviously saves the state some money. But again, it puts more burden on municipal finances, which we think is unfair.
So it was 10. They're talking about 3. We're saying maybe 7 is a reasonable kind of.
Yeah, we understand
like
that
we
the
could
state
pick it up a little bit because there's a reality that the state is having issues.
It does give towns time to plan on those adjustments.
Yeah,
I totally agree. That's the way we would see it. We need time to plan and make the adjustments.
Okay. Time to plan is good. Another issue kind of related to this is non-alliance districts. Could you talk a little bit about what those are, Selectman or George?
Yeah, so back, I guess in 2012, I think it was, Governor Malloy incorporated the Alliance District Program, which essentially is the 30, and now I think it's 33 lowest performing school districts in the state.
Okay.
And what they did is the Education Cost Sharing Grant, which is the big general education grant. What they did for those districts is said, okay, we're going to give you a base amount of ECS, but we're going to give you an additional pot of money. That money is going to be used separately. These districts, these school districts, are going to have to develop a plan for using that funding in order to get that funding.
These specific alliance districts.
Correct. So it was 30, and they added, once you're in for 5 years, and then you can get re-upped again. So they reevaluated after 5 years, which I believe was in 2017. So they added a few more. Those others that were in the program continue existing in the program. So since you have the 33 districts, I think the number is 33, and they are required to do certain things with that money. Now that causes some other issues. So for example, if you're getting your ECS money and you're a not alliance district, that's the other 130.
That's the other everybody else.
Everybody else, that money gets part of the education appropriation to the Board of Education. So it's used for education expenses, whether it's keeping the lights on or whether it's curriculum or hiring teachers. This alliance district money has to be used for specific programs to address the needs in those districts. So you can't use it for hiring for existing programs or for operating expenses. And that's actually a change that Governor Lamont has proposed, is to allow alliance districts to use some of that money for operating expenses, because we were hearing from the alliance districts that, this extra money is great, but if it's going toward new programs, it doesn't really help us
keep the lights
patch the roof, or help keeping existing programs going. So we are seeing a little bit of progress in that regard, but again, ECS is a whole other topic, and that funding and the issues that it caused in the last few years. So
yeah. And while we've been pushing to change the minimum budget requirements or get rid of them, what do we think legislatively? Is this something that's likely to happen, or is this something we're going to fight hard for?
I think it's going to have to be fought hard for. Yeah. I think the good news on this, Matt, is the fact that CCM and CABE are having some really excellent discussions on this in a very collaborative fashion. Both CCM and CABE understand each other's point of view. But in the end, from the way I understand it, it's really the Connecticut Department of Education that has to make the final decision. What I like about the process so far is CABE may testify and make the recommendation on this behalf, and then ultimately it's Connecticut, the Department of Education.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where the concept is good. The whole history behind the minimum budget requirement was that as towns get more of the CCS money, the General Assembly and the executive branches, they essentially wanted to ensure that money would be used for education, that towns wouldn't take that additional money and use it for other things. The problem is the ECS formula hasn't been used for years.
Yeah.
There's towns that are getting reductions in ECS, but they're not allowed to reduce their education budgets by an amount that they can, and still not affect the quality of education. I think that's important. So you can have a high performing district that doesn't get a lot of money from the state for ECS
because they're high performing.
Exactly, and they're wealthy in terms of town wealth as part of the formula, but they don't have relief in terms of saying we can perform. We have lower enrollment. We have we're closing a school because of enrollment, or we've made some adjustments in our finances with our municipal side, and we've caused some cost savings. Towns are allowed to reduce MBR by a little bit, but it's never enough. There are towns that can reduce it by a lot more without impacting the quality of education, but they're not allowed to. They're hamstrung. They're forced to spend just the same amount as they did the previous year.
And just off the top of my head, so the higher performing schools are getting less money. Is there any sort of sense of that almost being punishing them for doing well in some ways?
Yeah. Well, the reason they get less money is it's a formula that's a little bit complex. So it's based on your enrollment and the number of what they call need students. And those are students in poverty, students that are English language learners. The districts that have higher percentages of those students get additional money for those students. And that's understandable. They have higher costs. But the other side of it is the wealth of your town. And the way they measure wealth is they use household income and they use property wealth. So it's essentially your grand list. So the towns that have a lot of property wealth, that have maybe a higher median income, they'll get less ECS money than a comparable town with lower grand lists or less household income. So it's a formula that goes into it, and there's pros and cons to the formula, and the formula has been tweaked over the years, but the problem is the formula hasn't been used for a long time. Now they're starting to use it, and when they realize that they are starting to use it, that towns are going to win, some towns are going to get more money, some towns are going to get less based on the formula, and that's why they had this whole phase in, so that towns have time to adjust. So there's been issues with education funding. There's been issues with minimum budget requirement, and I think to Selectman Freda's point, I think the conversations with the boards of ed is great because they understand the issue as well. They want education funding, obviously, but they understand that there are cases where towns can reduce the education budget without impacting the quality of education, and I think having those discussions is really a great start.
Yeah. So the flip side of that, from the funding for the education, is the costs of education and cost saving. And one big topic this year has been regionalization of schools. It's been fairly unpopular. There's been a couple of plans there, but none of them have gotten really a lot of support in general. And even the governor this week kind of shifted his tone on that topic. Does sharing services make more sense than consolidating schools districts from the outset?
Oh, I think so. I think if you listen to the people, which we do, listen to the people of Connecticut, they don't want school regionalization. However, I think that they would accept efficiencies being derived between a municipality and a board of education. We do that all the time in North Haven. At one point in time, we consolidated our finance and business
Mhm.
managers. But that didn't work for us because our town is a little bit larger than that didn't work. So we went back to the other format. But I do think that there are areas, whether it's negotiating contracts, custodial contracts together, whatever it may be, there
Yeah.
are efficiencies in the system.
Kind of non-teacher positions. There's ways to do that.
Exactly.
And the other thing I heard is that you tried something like that and it didn't work for North Haven, but it might work for others. So it sounds like there's kind of not a one-size-fits-all solution on this
So
necessarily.
my sense on that, Matt, is it didn't work for us because of the size of our town, but maybe in the smaller towns it may work where the business manager, finance director can be shared without creating too much unintended consequences where other issues aren't getting done and attended to in terms of financial standpoint from the city side or town side.
All right, great. Let me pause one moment to let you know that you are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM, broadcasting live from downtown New Haven. We are streaming live on TuneIn Radio and newhavenindependent.org. We are also streaming live on Facebook Live. Just go to facebook.com/newhavenindependent or go to your Facebook page and look us up. All right, thanks. So another topic when we're talking about cost containment is retirement. And the state has created a new tier for the state retirement system, a tier 3. Do you think, Selectman, that we can amend the municipal employee retirement system to establish a tier consistent with the state?
So we're not in MERS, Matt. That's the municipal employee retirement system.
Okay.
We fully fund our pensions. We make 100% of the ARC, which is an acronym for annual required contribution. This is on the town side. Our Board of Ed, the teachers have a contribution to their pension plan at the state level. So I'm not one who is an expert on MERS because we do it the other way. And many years I've overfunded the pension. And what I've done also is, and the rating agencies like this, I personally went through the investment portfolio that we had on the pension plans and readjusted them with the assistance of some professional financial people. And keep this in mind, most municipalities have to return a 7.5% return on these pensions. And if you're below that, your ARC, your annual requirement contribution, goes up every year. It's an impact to the taxpayers. The goal is and should be to exceed the 7.5% potential ratio that you're trying to yield. Now we're up at 11% right now.
So you're doing good.
We're doing very well, and a lot of it's lost in the shuffle, so to speak. I think chief elected officials really need to look at the investment strategy, and we've been fortunate that we're exceeding the projected yield.
Yeah, you're fortunate. George, so obviously it's not an issue in North Haven, but for other towns that are in MERS, how would this affect them?
So there's actually, it's an interesting time with MERS. There's a couple of issues that are related. So first is, again, the tiers haven't changed. It's been in place for decades. And so we'd like to see some flexibility. And this would impact, it's important to know, this would impact new hires. So people existing in the system would not be impacted.
They're
so,
grandfathered in there.
Correct. So this would be for new hires, that they would be required to contribute a little bit more, and the plan would change slightly for those new individuals. There's another piece of this that relates to the cost, and that's a recent decision by the MERS, the retirement board at the state, to lower the assumed rate of return on their assets. So essentially what that does, and Selectman Freda kind of mentioned it, is the lower the rate of return that you assume, the more you're going to have to contribute to make up the full amount, right?
Yeah.
So they announced that they wanted to reduce, I think it's from 8 to 7 or 8 to 6.9%. They wanted to reduce the rate of return, which means that towns are going to now have to contribute more to make their annual ARC. So that's one side of it. And then obviously a new tier would help, because the employee would help contribute to those changes as well. So there are some issues with MERS funding right now. And if nothing is done, no new tiers are created, towns are going to be paying more just because the rate of return is assumed to be less now. So
and how many towns are part of MERS?
I believe the number is 81 or 82.
Okay, so about half the state.
About half the towns are in the system,
and the other half is doing it themselves, as North Haven does.
Correct. And those municipal pensions, you hear a lot about state pensions and state pension issues. Municipal pensions are pretty solid. There's obviously always one or two cases that are probably less funded than they should be, but for the most part, municipalities have done a
the
great
towns are
job.
handling it better than
They're handling
the
it
state.
very
Yeah,
well, and I think North Haven's a great example, and Selectman Freda's done a great job there.
definitely. So another proposal is to protect the budget reserve in binding arbitration. Selectman, how important is it that we have a 15% budget reserve, a rainy day fund, and should it be subject to arbitration?
I don't think it should be subject to arbitration, and let me explain that. There's a couple of different issues here.
Mm-hmm.
We have an 8% fund balance, and we always hit that and
Mm-hmm.
memorialize that in our Board of Finance. The rating agencies are very comfortable with that and like
Mm-hmm.
that. Sometimes the higher you go, some residents may perceive it as overtaxation. Whether that's
Mhm.
true or not, that sometimes is a perception.
Yeah.
But I believe that a collective bargaining agreement that may not be resolved through the CBA, collective bargaining agreement, if it has to go to arbitration, that to have to say that, well, that town or city has a 15% fund balance, they should pay it,
Mm-hmm.
I think undermines the issues that need to be resolved. Because why would someone say, well, that town can afford us to automatically pay it?
Yeah.
I think it needs to be resolved on the issues between management and labor. And I have to tell you, we've gone very few times to arbitration in
Mhm.
North Haven. We go back and forth in a very professional fashion with our unions, and we solve problems. I may need something on our side, and I may ask for it, but I understand I may have to give something
Yeah.
on the other side.
Just the way it works. George, you have anything to add on this topic?
No, I mean, I think, people see fund balance in some cases. They may not,
Mhm.
the citizen may not understand, or the public may not understand. They think it's, again, to Selectman Frieda's point about, well, you have this reserve in your budget. Why are you taxing me? You
Mhm.
just use that money. Well, rating agencies like to see that cushion to prepare for any unforeseen issues that you have in terms of municipal finance. And the Government Finance Officers Association, they have guidelines as well. In some cases, you'll see it 10, 12% they recommend. I don't think there's a magic number here.
Mhm.
But to say that that money is just money sitting there that should be made available for as part of a collective bargaining agreement or the town's ability to pay, I think is really false, just because that money has to be there. It's just
Yeah.
like having a savings account as an individual. You have to have an emergency fund
Mhm.
in case something happens.
Something happens. Yeah.
And you never know. It could be a natural disaster. It could be some major need in the town, some
Mhm.
capital facility that needs to be retrofitted, or something happens. And it's just like an individual.
Yeah.
You have your household budgets. You have to have that emergency savings. Or your washing machine breaks down, or your car breaks
Yeah.
down. How do you fix it? You don't want to
Yeah.
go to the credit card. So I think
If
that's
the
important.
roof on one of your school buildings collapses,
George makes an excellent point.
Mhm.
You know, at one time we were at 10%, and we brought it down to 8, and we used the 2% to help offset taxes in
Yeah.
future years. But I think the issue that we're talking about also revolves around the fact that just because a municipality may have a healthy fund balance and be financially, well run, that doesn't automatically mean that the collective bargaining process should be undermined or eliminated
Mhm.
because, well, they can pay for it. Let them just pay for it. That
Yeah.
I have a problem with.
because it's being well run isn't a reason to necessarily change the
Exactly.
way you do things. Yeah. So if we're gonna go to the complete opposite end of the discussion, we go from costs to revenue. There's some calls for revenue diversification. Selectman, one of our calls for revenue diversification was because of the pilot program. Can you talk about pilot and what that is to our listeners?
So pilot's an acronym for payment in lieu of taxes. When I
Mhm.
first took office, I think it was in 2009, I believe the pilot reimbursement was somewhere about 75 to 77% of the value of the tax-exempt property.
Yeah.
Today, I'd have to double check, but I think we're down around 33%. So a lot of us as municipalities have lost that revenue coming in from the pilot.
Yeah.
Now, what I've done in North Haven is try to develop voluntary payments with those tax-exempt
Mhm.
entities. And Quinnipiac University is a
It's a
good
big
example.
one. Yeah.
So we work very collaboratively with them. And when I look at the pilot that we get reimbursed for,
Mhm.
plus their voluntary payment that they give us, they now have become one of the larger taxpayers in the town of North Haven with the combination of the voluntary payment
Mhm.
and the pilot. But that doesn't mean I'm not a supporter of getting the pilot back to a more respectable level. I think we
Mhm.
need to do that.
George?
Yeah, no, it's important. So just for listeners to understand, there's obviously properties in the state that are tax exempt. These include
Universities, hospitals.
private colleges, hospitals, universities, and then state-owned property. So the state owns a lot of property. For example, in the city of Hartford, a significant portion of their tax base is state property, which is not taxable. So the state reimburses towns. It's supposed to be 45% for the state-owned property, with a couple exceptions, and then 77% for colleges and hospitals. Yeah. Well, those numbers, as Selectman Freda pointed out, are significantly below that. So the state's not reimbursing what they're supposed to. So towns are stuck. They're only able to use the property tax as a way to raise revenue, and then a lot of those properties are tax exempt, so their tax base is limited. And so the state, to their credit, set up a program to provide these pilots to towns, but they don't fully fund them. So towns are stuck. So they're looking for other ways to either, if the state is not going to fund the pilots, maybe other ways of generating revenue at the local level. To give towns more options to do that. The voluntary pilots are great. These tax exempt entities. Look, Quinnipiac University is a great citizen of the town of North Haven. But all these, whether it's a large hospital, a college, university, a state-owned property, they use services. They use the roads. If there's a fire call, the fire department comes out. They use police. And those are costs. Those are real costs
to the town.
So,
and one thing related to that. We were wondering, should we create a new community public safety and infrastructure fee for these properties?
It's difficult for me to say. If you look at some of these universities, as an example, they have their own police departments. They have a lot of resources that are already built in. So I may not be the best person to ask that, Matt. So I can't really say.
Well, that's okay, George. What do you think?
I think we need to look at, again, this is part of a larger discussion. Whether we're talking about school regionalization, we're talking about these investment or these infrastructure fees. Just a whole discussion around state and local partnership and how financing is done. The state government and local governments are partners in providing services. They all provide services to the same citizenry. They have different, obviously, education's done at the local level. Police is the local level, but we're all part of kind of the same thing. We're providing services, public services to our citizens, and we have to figure out, first of all, the costs associated with those services, and then how to pay for them. And whether it's the state paying more in pilot, or whether it's creating an infrastructure, a service and infrastructure fee at a local level that may work in one town and not another. So I think it goes back to our discussion earlier about there's not a one-size-fits-all for everything. So, but having these options and kind of a menu of giving towns the flexibility to do some of these things, I think is important.
And saying it's not one-size-fits-all. I know cities like Hartford and New Haven especially are hit hard by the tax-exempt properties. And the only way they can really raise money right now is the property tax, which is kind of a very regressive tax. Are there any proposals out there right now for cities to raise money without raising the property tax that can be done at the state level?
Well, there's been some discussion about sales tax changes, and not so much giving a local sales tax, but sharing some of that sales tax revenue with municipalities. The concern we have, and I think Selectman Freda would agree, was we've had programs like this in the past where we're going to collect an additional sales tax or part of the sales tax and give it to towns and cities. And as soon as the state has a budget issue, they take the money back. So towns can't count on that revenue. If they had their own ability to generate that revenue locally, or at least an option to do so, maybe they don't want to in their town. They don't want to hurt their tax base. So they're saying, we're not going to put a sales tax in place. We're going to manage our property tax and our grand list. But again, it's having those options. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a state mandate to say you shall do this or we're going to do this. It's giving those options, I think, is important and part of our message.
Selectman?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, coming back, I'll try to give you an answer to the question that I really couldn't answer. So I would say that in our case, we've had a great deal of success in the communication aspect of dealing with the nonprofits, the tax-exempt organizations. And I think the fundamental critical aspect of a town and gown relationship, as an example, is to have that trust, have that communication, and if there's a problem, to explain to the university or whomever it may be, this is what we're faced with. These are our calls for service. Is there a way we can bump up the voluntary payment, rather than mandate something? That, to me, I think undermines the trust and the communication that we may have in North Haven with this university. We're able to get things done through the communication.
By working together.
Yes.
And any thoughts on sales tax?
We've at CCM, we worked really in a bipartisan fashion to make some recommendations to the state. and it was mirrored by the Fiscal Stability Commission that was put into play. But as we learned that there was not an appetite or a capacity for any expansion from the sales tax, I think it was from 6.35 to 6.99.
Yeah.
That seemed to be against what the people wanted, so we backed off on that.
So you're not so much on that, or the board is.
Yeah, and I think we had heated discussions about this. You're going to have folks who are opposed to any tax increases. You're going to have folks who are opposed to other parts of our proposal. Our whole point with our program and our This Is Different report is it's a complete package. And there may be things in there that you don't agree with, or that a certain board member doesn't agree with, or a certain town manager or a first selectman or a mayor doesn't agree with, but they agree with other pieces. I think they realize you can't just pick and choose. This is a complete package. In the Fiscal Stability Committee, they were the same thing. They said, look, don't tell us you like this part of it and you don't like it. This is it won't work if you just take one of it. It's got to be a complete package. So
George made a good point earlier on the pilot, and state properties included also. What I see as a possible solution is it's the reverse of what we just spoke about with ECS, with potentially a 7-year declining scale.
Yeah.
You know, we realize we're practical, we're reasonable chief executive officials. We realize we may not be able to get up to 77 or 80% back on pilot, but maybe over a 7-year period, there can be an ascension from where we are now back to a plateau that may be somewhere between 50 and 60%. That, to me, is the cleanest way to help the municipalities rather than impose the more local taxes, I think.
That sounds great. So going from taxes and all this kind of less fun talk, one final topic we want to talk about is that just a little over a month, CCM is going to be having our second annual charity Triple Crown event. This is going to be an evening of horse racing themed food, fun, and entertainment, and the proceeds from this event will go to 3 great causes: Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery, Journey Home, and the Parent-Child Resource Center. So if you're going to look it up online, use the hashtags Racing to Give Back and CT Triple Crown. And join us on Friday, May 10th at 5:30 p.m. at the Hartford Club as we race to give back. You guys going to be there, you think?
Oh, I'll definitely be there. I was there last year, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
A lot of fun?
We'll be there. We'll be there.
Awesome.
It's a great event for a great cause.
And we have a little short video from our executive director, Joe DeLong, explaining a little bit more in depth what it's all about.
CCM is a state municipal league that represents the cities and towns all across Connecticut. We're a bipartisan organization that gets involved in helping advocate for things that affect local communities. The horse racing Triple Crown is a really interesting experience that a lot of people in Connecticut don't get to be a part of. So we decided that we could do something themed around the horse racing Triple Crown. So you come to an event and you actually experience what people experience in terms of the atmosphere, the food, the drinks, the camaraderie at the Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont. But each one of those rooms also represents a unique charity in Connecticut. So tying those two themes together, you know, the charitable event with that horse racing theme for a fun evening out and feeling like you're actually experiencing the horse racing Triple Crown, but you're experiencing it in a philanthropic way here in Connecticut and doing something that's going to benefit the communities that we serve. We've had several companies across the state of Connecticut that have already stepped up and chosen to sponsor this event. So what we ask people to do who are interested, go to our website, ccm-ct.org, and just click on the Triple Crown icon at the top, and it will walk you through all of the sponsorship levels. It will walk you through how to buy tickets. It will give you all the event information. We hope this is a premier event for the state of Connecticut every year, and all of it is tax deductible. What you pay all goes to the charities. You support a great cause. You write it off on your taxes, and you really have a wonderful evening.
I'd like to thank First Selectman Freda for coming in today, and George Rafael from CCM. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer. Christopher Gilson is our producer. Harry Draws is on the boards. And I'm Matt Ford, your host. Please be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like. Watch out for CCM Chat Series on YouTube page, and search for CCM Chats to find out all about it. See you next time.